The auction block in Millbrook's town square had seen many things sold over the years: livestock, farm equipment, foreclosed properties, but never a woman. Until that grey October morning in 1887, when Cassandra Whitmore stepped onto the weathered wooden platform, her face hidden behind a thick black veil, and changed the course of 2 lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills surrounding Millbrook like a shroud, and Jeremiah Kane pulled his worn leather coat tighter as he guided his horse through the muddy streets toward the town square. At 28, Jeremiah had the weathered hands of a man who'd spent his life working the land, but his eyes held a gentleness that seemed at odds with his imposing 6-foot frame. His ranch, the Double J, sat 15 miles north of town, a modest spread that he'd built from nothing after returning from 3 years of wandering the territories. Jeremiah wasn't a man of many words. In fact, most folks in Millbrook could count on one hand the number of complete sentences they'd heard him speak. He conducted his business with nods and gestures, paid his bills with exact change, and kept to himself in a way that wasn't unfriendly, just private. The townspeople had grown accustomed to his quiet presence at church on Sundays, always sitting in the back pew, hat in hand, listening but never participating in the social chatter that followed services. This particular morning, Jeremiah hadn't planned on attending the auction at all. He needed supplies, a new plow blade, some fence wire, maybe a decent saddle if the price was right, but auctions meant crowds, and crowds meant conversation he'd rather avoid. Still, necessity drove him forward, and as he tied his horse to the hitching post near Henderson's general store, he could already hear the auctioneer's voice carrying across the square. "Now, folks, we come to a most unusual lot today," called out Marcus Webb, the town's primary auctioneer, his voice booming over the gathered crowd of perhaps 40 people. "Miss Cassandra Whitmore, age 22, seeks a husband through arrangement. She comes with a dowry of $50 and the recommendation of Reverend Thomas Ashford of St. Mary's Parish in Denver." Jeremiah paused, his hand still on his horse's reins. A bride auction. He'd heard of such things in the rougher mining towns where desperate men paid for mail-order wives sight unseen, but he'd never witnessed one. Something about the spectacle made his stomach turn, yet he found himself drawn toward the crowd rather than away from it. The woman on the platform stood perfectly still, her black dress modest but well-made, her hands clasped in front of her. The veil that covered her face was unusual, not the delicate lace of mourning wear, but a heavy, concealing fabric that revealed nothing of her features. Even her hair was hidden beneath a dark bonnet. "The bidding will start at $20, Webb announced, scanning the crowd with practiced ease. "Who'll give me 20 for this fine young lady?" A murmur rippled through the gathered men. Some shifted uncomfortably, others whispered among themselves. Jeremiah noticed several faces he recognized: Tom Bradley, who owned the largest cattle ranch in the county; Samuel Morrison, the bank manager whose wife had died the previous winter; even young Pete Garrison, barely 18 and full of nervous energy. $20, called out Morrison, his voice steady but his face flushed. 25, countered Bradley almost immediately, his chest puffed with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. As the bidding continued, Jeremiah found himself studying the woman more closely. Despite the concealing veil, he could sense her tension in the rigid set of her shoulders, the white-knuckled grip of her clasped hands. She stood with her chin lifted, maintaining dignity in circumstances that would have broken many peoples. "Spirits, $50, Morrison called out, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. 60, Bradley responded without hesitation. The bidding had eliminated most of the casual observers. Only 3 men remained active: Morrison, Bradley, and surprisingly young Pete Garrison, who seemed to be bidding with money he likely didn't have. The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama. Jeremiah felt an uncomfortable knot forming in his stomach as he watched the proceedings. This wasn't livestock or farm equipment being sold. This was a human being, a woman who deserved better than to be bartered over like property. He thought about walking away, about collecting his supplies and returning to the quiet solitude of his ranch. But something held him there. Maybe it was the way she held herself with such dignity despite her circumstances. Maybe it was the protective instinct that had always run strong in him, the same instinct that had led him to take in injured animals and nurse them back to health on his ranch. Or maybe it was something else entirely, a recognition of isolation that mirrored his own. $75, Morrison announced, his voice cracking slightly. Bradley's eyes narrowed. He clearly hadn't expected the competition to be so fierce. 80. Young Pete Garrison looked stricken. $80 was more than most men in Millbrook made in 3 months. He stepped back from the bidding circle, his face red with embarrassment and disappointment. $80, Webb repeated. Do I hear 85? Morrison opened his mouth, then closed it. His shoulders sagged in defeat. $80 was clearly his limit. $80 once, Webb called out. $80 twice. Jeremiah surprised himself by stepping forward. $100. The crowd turned as one to stare at him. Even through her veil, he could sense the woman's attention focusing on him. Bradley's face darkened with anger. He clearly hadn't expected competition from the quiet rancher. 100? Well, Webb grinned, sensing the potential for higher profits. Mr. Kane enters the bidding at 100. Do I hear 110? Bradley's jaw worked as he considered his options. $100 was serious money, more than he'd planned to spend. But his pride was at stake now, and Tom Bradley wasn't. A man who liked to lose. 110. Jeremiah felt every eye in the square upon him. Public attention was the last thing he wanted, but something about this situation demanded action. He thought about the woman's posture, the dignity she maintained despite being auctioned like cattle. He thought about Morrison's leering grin and Bradley's possessive glare. Neither man struck him as someone who would treat a wife with the respect she deserved. 125, Jeremiah said quietly, but his voice carried clearly across the square. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. $125 was more money than most of them saw in half a year. Bradley's face flushed deep red, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. 125, Webb repeated with barely contained excitement. Do I hear? 130, Bradley opened his mouth, then closed it again. His practical side warred with his pride, and for once practicality won. He shook his head and stepped back, his expression thunderous. $125 once, Webb called out, scanning the crowd for any last-minute bidders. 125 twice. He paused dramatically, his gavel raised. Sold to Mr. Jeremiah Kane for $125. The crowd erupted in surprised chatter. Jeremiah Kane, the quiet rancher who barely spoke to anyone, had just paid more money than anyone had expected for a veiled bride he'd never even seen. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. As Webb banged his gavel to restore order, Jeremiah felt the full weight of what he'd just done settling on his shoulders. He'd acted on impulse, driven by something he couldn't quite name, and now he found himself committed to marrying a complete stranger. A woman whose face he'd never seen, whose voice he'd never heard, whose story remained a complete mystery. The woman, Cassandra, he reminded himself, remained motionless on the platform as Webb handled the administrative details. Marriage arrangements needed to be made, papers signed, money exchanged. But all of that seemed secondary to the moment when she would finally turn to face him, when whatever lay behind that veil would be revealed. As the crowd began to disperse, Many casting curious glances back at the unlikely pair, Jeremiah approached the platform. Up close, he could see that Cassandra's dress, while modest, was made of good quality fabric. Her hands, though clasped tightly, were well cared for, not the rough, calloused hands of someone who'd known only hard labor. These small details only deepened the mystery surrounding her. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, his voice barely audible, over the continuing buzz of conversation around them. "I'm Jeremiah Kane." She nodded slightly, a barely perceptible movement that acknowledged his presence without revealing anything about herself. Her silence matched his own, but where his came from choice, hers seemed born of necessity or fear. Webb approached with a leather portfolio under his arm, his face still flushed with excitement from the unexpected bidding war. "Mr. Kane, if we could handle the paperwork, there are certain formalities, you understand. The marriage will need to be performed today, as per the arrangement." Today. The word hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. He'd known, intellectually, that bride auctions typically resulted in immediate marriages. There was no extended courtship period, no time to get to know each other. But the reality of it felt overwhelming. "The Reverend Matthews can perform the ceremony this afternoon," Webb continued, oblivious to Jeremiah's discomfort. 2 o'clock at the church, if that suits you both." Jeremiah nodded slowly, then looked up at Cassandra. "Miss Whitmore, is that acceptable to you?" Again, just the slightest nod. Her continued silence was beginning to worry him. Was she simply shy, or was there something more troubling behind her reticence? As Webb bustled away to make arrangements, Jeremiah found himself alone with his bride-to-be for the first time. The platform elevated her enough that they stood nearly eye to eye, though the veil still concealed her completely. "I know this isn't conventional," he said quietly, choosing his words carefully. "I want you to know that you'll be safe at my ranch. I won't. That is, I don't expect—" He trailed off, unsure how to communicate his intentions without embarrassing them both. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For the first time she spoke. Her voice was soft, refined, with just a hint of an Eastern accent. "Thank you, Mr. Kane. I understand." 3 simple words, but they told him more than he'd learned all morning. She was educated. Her pronunciation was careful, cultivated. She wasn't a desperate frontier woman seeking any escape from poverty. So what had brought her to this auction block in a small Colorado town? The hours between the auction and the wedding ceremony passed in a blur. Jeremiah handled the practical matters, purchasing a simple gold ring from Henderson's store, arranging for his horse and wagon to transport them back to the ranch, trying to prepare mentally for the enormous change his life was about to undergo. He'd lived alone for so long that the idea of sharing his space, his daily routines, his carefully constructed solitude, felt almost impossible to imagine. The ranch. House was modest but comfortable. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a sitting room with a stone fireplace he'd built himself. It had always been enough for his simple needs, but now he found himself seeing it through different eyes, wondering what a woman would think of his bachelor quarters. 10 minutes before 2, Jeremiah stood at the altar of Millbrook's small wooden church, his hands clasped behind his back to hide their trembling. Reverend Matthews, a kindly man in his 60s with a perpetually worried expression, had agreed to perform the ceremony despite its unusual circumstances. Quite unusual, he'd muttered while reviewing the paperwork. Quite unusual indeed, but legal, I suppose, if all parties consent. The church was nearly empty. Just Webb as a witness, Mrs. Henderson from the general store, who'd apparently decided this was too interesting to miss, and a handful of other townspeople who'd lingered after the morning's excitement. Jeremiah wished they'd all stayed home. He'd never been comfortable being the center of attention, and a wedding, even one as unconventional as this, inevitably made the participants the focus of every eye. At exactly 2 o'clock, the church door opened, and Cassandra entered. She'd changed clothes since the morning. Instead of the black dress, she now wore a simple but elegant dress of deep blue wool. But the veil remained, as concealing as ever. She walked down the short aisle with measured steps, her spine straight, her hands steady at her sides. As she took her place beside him at the altar, Jeremiah caught a faint scent of lavender water. It was the first truly personal detail he'd learned about her, and somehow it made the entire situation feel more real. Reverend Matthews cleared his throat and opened his worn Bible. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Jeremiah Kane and Cassandra Whitmore in holy matrimony. The familiar words washed over Jeremiah without really registering. His entire attention was focused on the woman beside him, on the mystery she represented, on the enormous leap of faith they were both taking. When the Reverend reached the part about speaking now or forever holding one's peace, Jeremiah half expected someone to object, perhaps Bradley, still angry about losing the bidding, or Morrison, who'd been drinking steadily since the auction ended, but the church remained silent except for Mrs. Henderson's nervous coughing. Do you, Jeremiah Kane, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? I do, Jeremiah replied, his voice stronger than he'd expected. And do you, Cassandra Whitmore, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part? I do. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the small church. The rings, please. Jeremiah fumbled in his pocket for the simple gold band he'd purchased. His hands were steadier now as he slipped it onto Cassandra's finger. She had no ring for him. They hadn't discussed it, and he hadn't thought to purchase one for himself. By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Reverend Matthews paused, then added, with a note of uncertainty, you may, that is, if you wish to. The moment had arrived, the moment when Cassandra would either lift her veil or... Jeremiah wasn't sure what the alternative might be. Could they remain married, with her face still concealed? The situation was unprecedented. In his experience, slowly, deliberately, Cassandra reached up to the edge of her veil. Jeremiah held his breath, aware that everyone in the church had fallen completely silent. Even Mrs. Henderson had stopped coughing. The veil lifted, and Jeremiah's world shifted on its axis. What Jeremiah saw beneath the veil wasn't what he'd expected, not the hideous disfigurement that the heavy fabric had implied, but something far more complex. The left side of Cassandra's face was indeed marked by burn scars, a pattern of raised pinkish skin that ran from her temple down to her jaw. But the scars told a story of survival, not destruction. Her right profile remained untouched, revealing delicate features and intelligent hazel eyes that watched his reaction with a mixture of defiance and vulnerability. She was beautiful, not in spite of the scars, but in a way that transcended them entirely. Her beauty lay in the strength of her gaze, the determined set of her mouth, the courage it must have taken to stand on that auction block, knowing that this moment of revelation was inevitable. "Hello, husband," she said quietly, the words carrying a weight of resignation mixed with something that might have been relief. Jeremiah realized he'd been staring and felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Hello, wife," he replied, the word feeling strange on his tongue, but not unpleasant. The small gathering in the church began to murmur among themselves, but Jeremiah ignored them. He offered Cassandra his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. Together, they walked down the aisle and out into the afternoon sunlight, leaving behind the whispered speculation of Millbrook's residence. The wagon ride to the Double J Ranch stretched for nearly an hour across rolling prairie dotted with stands of aspen and pine. For the first 20 minutes, neither spoke. Cassandra sat beside him on the wagon seat, her hands folded in her lap, the veil now pushed back to reveal her profile against the autumn landscape. Jeremiah found himself stealing glances at her, trying to reconcile the mystery he'd married with the flesh and blood woman beside him. "The scars," she said suddenly without looking at him. "You're wondering about them. Only if you want to." "Tell me," Jeremiah replied, his eyes focused on the road ahead. "We all carry marks from our past. Some are just more visible than others." She turned to study his face, as if searching for signs of pity or disgust. Finding neither, she seemed to relax slightly. "There was a fire 3 years ago in Denver. I was visiting my aunt's house when the kitchen stove exploded, a pot of cooking oil." She touched the scarred side of her face unconsciously. "I was fortunate to survive. Many didn't." The simple explanation raised more questions than it answered, but Jeremiah sensed that pushing for details would be counterproductive. Instead, he nodded and said, "I'm sorry you went through that." "The scars aren't the worst part," Cassandra continued, her voice taking on a bitter edge. "It's how people look at you afterward, how conversations stop when you enter a room, how suitors suddenly remember pressing engagements elsewhere." "Their loss," Jeremiah said simply. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Is it? I'm damaged goods, Mr. Kane. That's why I ended up on an auction block in Colorado instead of married to a banker in Boston." "You're not damaged," Jeremiah replied with quiet conviction. "You're marked by experience, same as anyone who's lived through hardship. The difference is your marks show." They rode in comfortable silence after that, the rhythmic creaking of the wagon wheels and the steady clip-clop of the horses providing a peaceful soundtrack to their journey. As they created a low hill, the Double J Ranch spread out before them. A modest 2-story house with a wide front porch, a sturdy barn, several outbuildings and corrals containing a small herd of cattle and horses. "It's not much," Jeremiah said, suddenly seeing his property through a stranger's eyes, "but it's honest land, and it provides." Cassandra studied the homestead with an appraising eye. "It's beautiful," she said, and he could tell she meant it. "How long have you lived here?" "Built the house 5 years ago. Been working the land for 7. Started with nothing but a deed and a pile of lumber." He guided the wagon down the gentle slope toward the house. "Had help from neighbors for the barn raising, but most of it I did myself." As they approached the house, a large black and tan dog emerged from the barn, tail wagging enthusiastically. "That's Rex," Jeremiah said. "He's friendly, but if you'd rather he kept his distance." "I love dogs," Cassandra replied, and for the first time since he'd met her, she smiled genuinely. The expression transformed her face, making the scars seem like nothing more than interesting geography. Rex bounded up to the wagon as Jeremiah brought it to a halt near the front porch. The dog's attention immediately focused on Cassandra, who extended her hand for him to sniff before scratching behind his ears. "He likes you," Jeremiah observed, climbing down from the wagon. "Rex is usually suspicious of strangers." "Animals see differently than people," Cassandra replied, accepting Jeremiah's hand as she stepped down. "They're not concerned with appearances." Jeremiah carried her single traveling bag, a well-made leather case that had seen better days, up the front steps and opened the door to his home. The interior was clean but sparse, furnished with pieces he'd built himself or acquired through necessity rather than comfort. The main room served as both kitchen and sitting area, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a simple wooden table occupying the center. "The bedroom is upstairs," Jeremiah said, then quickly added, "I mean, there are two bedrooms upstairs. You can have the larger one. I usually sleep in the smaller room anyway." The words tumbled out awkwardly, and he felt his face burning with embarrassment. Cassandra's lips quivered upward in what might have been amusement. "Thank you. That's very considerate." An uncomfortable silence settled between them as the reality of their situation became apparent. They were married strangers, bound by law and circumstance, but knowing virtually nothing about each other's daily habits, preferences, or expectations. The practical matters of cohabitation, meals, chores, personal space, suddenly seemed enormously uncomplicated. "I should show you around," Jeremiah said finally, "help you get settled." The tour didn't take long. Besides the main room, the ground floor contained a small pantry and a washroom. Upstairs, two bedrooms flanked a narrow hallway. The larger room, which Jeremiah had designated as hers, contained a simple bed frame, a chest of drawers, and a window that looked out over the ranch's eastern pasture. "I can bring up some things to make it more comfortable," Jeremiah offered. "There's a rocking chair downstairs, some extra blankets." "It's fine," Cassandra assured him. "I've grown accustomed to simple accommodations." Another piece of the puzzle was his new wife. What had her life been like between the fire in Denver and the auction block in Millbrook? The question burned in his mind, but he sensed that pushing for answers would only make her retreat further. "Supper," he said suddenly. I usually cook for myself, but I'm not sure what you prefer." "I can cook," Cassandra said quickly. "I mean, if you'd like. I'm actually quite good at it." Relief flooded through Jeremiah. Cooking was one of his least favorite chores, and he'd been dreading the awkwardness of trying to navigate meal preparation with a virtual stranger. I'd appreciate that." They made their way back downstairs, where Cassandra began examining his larder with a practiced eye. His supplies were basic but adequate: salt pork, dried beans, flour, preserved vegetables, and a few other staples. She nodded approvingly and began laying out ingredients with efficient movements. "You can tell me about the ranch," she said as she worked, her hands busy with preparations. "How many cattle do you run? What crops do you grow?" Jeremiah found himself relaxing as he described his operation. The Double J wasn't large, perhaps 200 head of cattle, a dozen horses, and enough farmland to grow hay and grain for winter feed. He spoke of the seasonal rhythms, the challenges of weather and predators, the satisfaction of building something from nothing through honest work. As he talked, Cassandra prepared what turned out to be an excellent beef stew, seasoned with herbs she'd apparently carried in her traveling bag. The kitchen filled with aromas that made Jeremiah's mouth water. It had been months since he'd eaten anything more complex than beans and bacon. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked as they sat down to eat. "My mother," Cassandra replied. She believed that a woman should be accomplished in domestic arts, regardless of her social station. She paused, her spoon halfway to her mouth. "She died 2 years before the fire. I'm grateful she didn't live to see what became of me. What became of you was survival," Jeremiah said firmly. "There's no shame in that." Cassandra studied his face in the lamplight. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Honestly, a man desperate enough to buy a bride at auction, sight unseen. I expected someone rough, crude, someone who saw women as property to be acquired." She gestured around the neat kitchen. "Not someone who gives up his own bedroom and offers to carry furniture upstairs." Jeremiah felt uncomfortable under her scrutiny. "I've never been married before. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do." "Neither have I," Cassandra admitted. "This is uncharted territory for both of us." After supper, they established a tentative routine. Cassandra insisted on washing the dishes, while Jeremiah tended to the evening chores, feeding the animals, checking the fences, ensuring everything was secure for the night. When he returned to the house, He found her sitting by the fireplace with a piece of needlework, the lamplight casting gentle shadows across her features. "Do you read?" she asked, without looking up from her embroidery. "Some. Not much time for it during the day." "I brought books," she said, "if you'd like to borrow any of them." The offer surprised him. Most of the women he'd known in his limited experience had little interest in reading beyond the occasional ladies' home journal. "What kind of books?" "Poetry, some novels, a few philosophical works." She glanced up at him. "I had a good education before circumstances changed." Another glimpse into her past, tantalizing in its brevity. Jeremiah found himself genuinely curious about this woman he'd married, about the life she'd led before the fire that had scarred more than just her face. "Philosophy," he repeated. "Can't say I've read much of that." "Perhaps we could read together sometimes," Cassandra suggested. "In the evenings, when the work is done." The idea appealed to him more than he'd expected. The long winter nights ahead had always been a source of loneliness, filled with little but the sound of wind and the crackling of the fire. The prospect of companionship, of conversation, of shared activities suddenly made the seasons seem less daunting. "I'd like that," he said. As the evening wore on, they talked in careful, tentative exchanges, not the deep conversation of intimates, but the cautious exploration of two people trying to map the boundaries of their new relationship. Cassandra spoke sparingly of her past, but Jeremiah began to piece together fragments of a story. A privileged upbringing in Boston, the loss of parents, the fire that had changed everything, and some unspecified series of events that had led her west to the auction block. For his part, Jeremiah found himself more talkative than he'd been in years. Something about Cassandra's attentive listening, her thoughtful questions, drew words from him that he'd kept locked inside. He told her about his childhood on his family's farm in Missouri, about the restlessness that had driven him west after his parents died, about the satisfaction he'd found in building something with his own hands. When the fire burned low and exhaustion began to weigh on them both, they faced the awkward moment of retiring for the night. They were married, legally bound, but still strangers in every way that mattered. "Good night, Cassandra," Jeremiah said as she gathered her needlework. "Good night, Jeremiah," she replied. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she added, "Thank you. For today, for treating me with kindness." As she climbed the stairs to her room, Jeremiah banked the fire and tried to process the enormity of what had occurred. This morning he'd been a bachelor, content in his solitude. Now he was a married man, sharing his home with a woman whose courage and dignity had impressed him far more than her scars had disturbed him. He settled into his own bed in the smaller upstairs room, listening to the subtle sounds of Cassandra moving about in the room next door. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel empty. Whether that was a good thing or a source of complications, yet to come, only time would tell. But as sleep finally claimed him, Jeremiah found himself looking forward to tomorrow's conversations, to learning more about the remarkable woman who had become his wife, to discovering what shape their unusual partnership might take. The last thing he heard before drifting off was the soft sound of pages turning in the next room, and he smiled to himself in the darkness. Dawn came early to the Double J Ranch, and with it the realization that everything had changed. Jeremiah woke to unfamiliar sounds. The soft footsteps of someone moving carefully through the house, the gentle clatter of dishes being arranged, the whisper of fabric against wood. For a moment, suspended between sleep and waking, he forgot about the previous day's events. Then memory flooded back, and he sat up with a start. He was married to a woman he barely knew, a woman who was, at this very moment, apparently preparing breakfast in his kitchen. Jeremiah dressed quickly and made his way downstairs, where he found Cassandra standing at the stove, her hair pinned up in a practical bun, wearing a simple brown dress protected by one of his own work aprons. The scent of coffee and frying bacon filled the air, and Rex sat hopefully nearby, his tail thumping against the floor. "Good morning," Cassandra said without turning around. "I hope you don't mind that I made myself at home with your supplies." "Not at all," Jeremiah replied, pouring himself coffee from the pot she'd prepared. "How long have you been awake?" "Since before sunrise. I've always been an early riser." She glanced at him over her shoulder. "I wasn't sure of your routine, so I made enough for both of us." The breakfast she'd prepared put his usual fare of cold biscuits and leftover beans to shame. Fresh eggs scrambled with wild onions she'd somehow found behind the house, thick slices of bacon, and biscuits that were still warm from the oven. They ate in companionable silence, both seeming to recognize that the daylight hours would bring their own challenges. "What can I do to help?" Cassandra asked as Jeremiah prepared to begin his morning chores. "Help?" The question caught him off guard. In his experience, ranch work was men's work, demanding physical strength and familiarity with potentially dangerous animals. "I don't expect to be ornamental," she said firmly. "I need to earn my place here, and I suspect you could use an extra pair of hands." Jeremiah studied her face, noting the determined set of her jaw. "Have you ever worked with livestock?" "No, but I can learn. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I'm not as fragile as I might appear." Against his better judgment, Jeremiah found himself nodding. "All right, but you do exactly what I tell you when I tell you. Cattle can be unpredictable, and I won't have you getting hurt." Their first task was feeding the horses, a relatively safe introduction to ranch work. Cassandra listened carefully to Jeremiah's instructions, asking thoughtful questions about each animal's temperament and needs. She showed no fear when Thunder, his largest stallion, snorted and stamped at her. Approach, instead speaking to the horse in low, soothing tones until he settled. "You have a way with them," Jeremiah observed, impressed despite himself. "Animals respond to confidence and respect," Cassandra replied, stroking Thunder's neck. "My father kept horses when I was young. I spent many hours in the stables." Another fragment of her past, offered without prompting. Jeremiah filed it away with the other clues she'd provided: the educated speech, the refined manners, the mention of servants and social obligations. Cassandra Whitmore had clearly fallen far from whatever heights she'd once occupied. As the morning progressed, they worked their way through the daily routine. Cassandra proved surprisingly capable, learning quickly and adapting to each new task. When they moved to the chicken coop, she showed no squeamishness about collecting eggs or dealing with the aggressive rooster that terrorized most visitors to the ranch. "How do you know how to do that?" Jeremiah asked, watching her efficiently corner and calm the belligerent bird. "My aunt in Denver kept chickens," she explained. "I lived with her for several months after my parents died. She believed in keeping me busy." The morning flew by, and by the time they broke for lunch, Jeremiah had to admit that Cassandra's help had made the work considerably easier. More than that, her presence had made the solitary routine more enjoyable. He'd grown so accustomed to his own company that he'd forgotten the pleasure of sharing tasks with someone who understood their importance. "This afternoon, I thought I'd check the north pasture," Jeremiah said, as they sat down to the simple meal Cassandra had prepared. "Some of the cattle have been drifting toward the creek, and I want to make sure the fence is holding. May I come with you?" Cassandra asked. "I'd like to see more of the ranch." The ride to the north pasture took them through some of the most beautiful country on the Double J. Rolling hills covered in autumn grass, stands of aspen trees turning gold and orange, and distant mountain peaks capped with early snow. Cassandra rode easily on Bella, a gentle mare Jeremiah had selected for her, and he found himself studying her profile as she took in the scenery. "It's magnificent," she said, gesturing toward the mountains. "I've lived in cities most of my life. I'd forgotten how peaceful the country could be." It's not always peaceful, Jeremiah warned. Winters can be brutal, and there's always something trying to go wrong. Wolves, drought, market prices, sick animals, but it's yours, Cassandra replied. You built this with your own hands, made. Something from nothing. That must be incredibly satisfying. Her words touched something deep in Jeremiah's chest. He'd never tried to explain to anyone why he'd chosen this life, why he'd left civilization behind to carve out a homestead in the wilderness. Most people saw only the hardships, the isolation, the constant struggle against nature. Cassandra seemed to understand the deeper satisfaction, the sense of purpose that came from creating something lasting. They found the fence intact, but discovered tracks that made Jeremiah frown. "Wolf sign," he explained, dismounting to examine the prints more closely. "Fresh, probably from last night." "Is that dangerous?" Cassandra asked, her hand unconsciously moving to rest on Thunder's neck. "Could be. Wolves usually avoid humans, but they'll take cattle if they're hungry enough. I'll need to keep a closer eye on the herd." He remounted and turned toward home. "We should head back. I want to check the other pastures before dark." As they rode back across the ranch, Cassandra asked questions about everything she saw. The different grasses, the seasonal patterns of the wildlife, the challenges of managing cattle in open-range country. Her curiosity was genuine, and Jeremiah found himself explaining things he'd never had to put into words before. "You said you built the house yourself," she said, as the buildings came into view. "How did you know how to do that?" "Trial and error, mostly," Jeremiah admitted. "My father was handy with tools, and I watched him repair things around our farm. But building from scratch, I made plenty of mistakes. It looks solid to me. It'll do. I built it to last, not to impress anyone." That evening, after another excellent meal prepared by Cassandra, they settled into what was becoming their routine. Jeremiah tended to his account books and correspondence, while Cassandra worked on her needlework. But instead of the comfortable silence of the previous evening, tension seemed to fill the air. "Jeremiah," Cassandra said suddenly, setting down her embroidery, "we need to discuss something." The serious tone of her voice made him look up from his ledger. "What is it?" "This arrangement we've entered into. I need to understand what you expect from me." "What do you expect from this marriage?" The question he'd been dreading. Jeremiah set down his pen and considered his words carefully. "I expect honesty, respect, the same things any partners might expect from each other." "Partners," she repeated, "not husband and wife in the traditional sense." Heat crept up Jeremiah's neck. "I won't force anything on you, if that's what you're asking. You're here because circumstances brought you here, not because you chose me. I understand that." Cassandra was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the lamplight. "And if I told you that I'd like this to be a real marriage eventually, not immediately, but in time?" The words hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on being honorable, on not taking advantage of her situation, that he hadn't allowed himself to consider the possibility that she might want more than a marriage of convenience. "I'd say that would be up to you," he replied carefully. "I won't push, but I won't refuse either, if that's what you want." "Good," she said, picking up her needlework again. "I think we understand each other." The next few days fell into a pattern that surprised Jeremiah with its naturalness. Cassandra proved herself increasingly capable around the ranch, learning to milk the cow, tend the vegetable garden, and even help with minor repairs. Her presence transformed the Double J from a functional operation into something that felt like a home. But it was the evenings that Jeremiah found himself anticipating most. After the day's work was done, they would sit by the fire and talk. Really. Talk in a way Jeremiah had never experienced with another person. Cassandra spoke of books she'd read, places she'd traveled, ideas that interested her. In return, Jeremiah found himself sharing thoughts and observations he'd never voiced aloud. "You're an intelligent man," she said one evening as they discussed a poem she'd been reading. "More intelligent than you give yourself credit for. Why did you choose this isolated life?" The question made Jeremiah uncomfortable. He'd never tried to explain his choices to anyone, partly because no one had ever asked with genuine interest. "I like the quiet," he said finally. "In towns, there's always noise, always people wanting something from you. Here I can think." "And what do you think about it?" "Everything. Nothing. The way the light changes on the mountains, the patterns the wind makes in the grass, is the best way to solve a problem with the cattle." He paused, struggling to find words for concepts he'd never articulated. "I suppose I think about what it means to live a good life. And what does it mean? Honesty, hard work, leaving something better than you found it." He looked at her across the firelight. "What about you? What did you think about before?" Cassandra's expression grew distant. "I thought about duty, about meeting expectations, about the proper way to behave in society." Her voice took on a bitter edge. "I thought about finding a suitable husband who would elevate my family's status. I thought about wearing the right clothes and saying the right things and never ever causing a scandal. And now? Now I think about whether the chickens are laying, well, and if the fence will hold through the winter, and what I can make for dinner with the supplies we have on hand." She smiled, and the expression was genuine. "I think about useful things." On Sunday, they attended church together in Millbrook. Jeremiah had dreaded the experience, knowing that their unusual marriage would be the subject of intense scrutiny. But Cassandra handled the attention with grace, nodding politely to the other women and ignoring the whispered conversations that followed in their wake. "That went better than I expected," Jeremiah said as they drove home. "Did it? I felt like a specimen in a naturalist's collection." But her tone was more amused than bitter. "Give them time. They'll find something else to talk about soon enough." "And if they don't?" Jeremiah considered the question seriously. "Then we'll deal with it. Together." The word hung between them, charged, with new meaning. They were partners now, in more than just the practical sense. They were building something together, creating a life that belonged to both of them. That night, as Jeremiah prepared for bed, he realized that the loneliness that had been his constant companion for so many years had vanished without his noticing. The house felt complete now, filled with the subtle signs of Cassandra's presence, the scent of her lavender water, the sound of her humming as she worked, the knowledge that someone cared about his daily struggles and successes. When he finally drifted off to sleep, it was with the thought that perhaps his impulsive bid at the auction had been the smartest thing he'd ever done, not because he'd acquired a wife, but because he'd found a partner who understood the value of building something, lasting together. In the room next door, Cassandra lay awake thinking similar thoughts. The auction block seemed like a distant memory now, a nightmare that had somehow led to this unexpected contentment. She'd come to Colorado expecting to endure marriage to a stranger, but she was beginning to hope for something far more precious, a true partnership with a man who saw her as more than her scars, more than her past, more than the damaged goods she'd believed herself to be. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but full of possibility. And for the first time in years, Cassandra found herself looking forward to tomorrow. The first storm of winter arrived without warning, sweeping down from the mountains with a fury that turned the world white in a matter of hours. Jeremiah had felt it coming in his bones that morning, the peculiar pressure in the air, the restless behavior of the animals, the way the wind carried a bite that promised worse to come. By noon, the snow was falling so thick that he could barely see from the house to the barn. "We need to bring the cattle closer," he told Cassandra, as they watched the storm intensify through the kitchen window. "If this keeps up, they'll drift. With the wind and get lost in the blizzard. What can I do to help? She asked, already reaching for her heavy coat. Stay inside where it's warm, Jeremiah replied automatically, then caught the flash of hurt that crossed her face. Over the past 3 weeks, Cassandra had proven herself capable and willing, but this was different. This was dangerous work in conditions that could kill. I'm not made of glass, she said quietly, but with steel beneath the words. If there's work to be done, I can do my part. Jeremiah looked at her, really looked at her. The refined lady who'd stood on the auction block had been replaced by someone stronger, more practical. Her hands, once soft, now bore the small calluses of honest work. Her posture spoke of confidence earned through competence. She wasn't the same woman he'd married a month ago, and he wasn't the same man who'd thought a wife would be a burden to protect rather than a partner to rely upon. All right, he said, but you stay close to me, no matter what. If I tell you to do something, you do it immediately, no questions. Understood? Understood. They bundled up in every piece of warm clothing they could find and headed out into the storm. The wind hit them like a living thing, driving snow into every exposed inch of skin and making it nearly impossible to see more than a few yards ahead. Rex bounded alongside them, his thick coat providing natural protection against the elements. The cattle had indeed begun to drift, seeking shelter wherever they could find it. Some had gathered in the lee of a stand of pine trees, while others had wandered dangerously close to the creek that formed the eastern boundary of the ranch. In summer, the creek was a gentle stream. In winter storms like this, it could become a death trap for animals that fell through thin ice. We'll start with the ones by the creek, Jeremiah shouted over the wind. Those are in the most danger. Working together, they began the exhausting process of herding the cattle back toward the barn and the sheltered areas closer to the house. Cassandra proved invaluable, seeming to understand instinctively how to position herself to guide the animals. Without spooking them, her presence allowed Jeremiah to cover more ground, to push the herd more effectively than he could have managed alone. But the storm was getting worse, and what should have been a 2-hour job stretched into 4. By the time they finally got the last of the cattle to safety, both Jeremiah and Cassandra were exhausted, soaked through despite their heavy clothes, and chilled to the bone. Inside, Jeremiah gasped as they stumbled back toward the house. We need to get warm before we freeze solid. The warmth of the kitchen felt like a blessing after hours in the bitter cold. Cassandra's lips were blue, and she was shivering so violently she could barely speak. Jeremiah quickly built up the fire and put water on to heat, then turned to find her struggling with the buttons of her coat, with fingers too numb to function properly. Here, he said, stepping close to help her with the fastenings. Your hands are like ice. As he worked to free her from the soaked garments, their eyes met and something shifted between them. The physical closeness, the shared exhaustion, the knowledge that they'd worked together to save the herd, it all combined into a moment of profound connection that had nothing to do with marriage contracts or convenient arrangements. Thank you, Cassandra whispered, for letting me help, for treating me as an equal. Thank you, Jeremiah replied, his voice rough with cold and something else, for being here. He struggled to find words for what he meant, for making this feel like home. They stood there for a moment, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes and could count the faint freckles that dotted her unscarred cheek. Then common sense reasserted itself, and they stepped apart, both suddenly aware of how their wet clothes clung to their bodies. Hot bath, Jeremiah said gruffly. Both of us, before we catch our deaths. The next few hours were spent in the careful dance of 2 people sharing a small space while maintaining propriety. They took turns with the large washtub in front of the kitchen fire, warming themselves with hot water and dry clothes. Cassandra prepared hot soup that seemed to restore life to Jeremiah's frozen core, while he tended to the animals and checked the storm's progress. By evening, the blizzard had settled into a steady snowfall that would likely continue through the night. They were effectively trapped in the house until it passed, but neither seemed to mind. If anything, the enforced isolation felt cozy rather than confining. "I've been thinking," Cassandra said as they sat by the fire after supper. "About what?" "You said the other day about living a good life. What about it? I think I'm beginning to understand what you meant." She set down her needlework and looked directly at him. "For most of my life, I measured goodness by external standards, wealth, status, social approval. But those things can disappear in an instant." Jeremiah nodded, remembering his own journey, away from the expectations of others. "What matters is what you build with your own hands, what you give to others, how you treat the world around you." "Exactly." Cassandra smiled, and the expression transformed her face in the firelight. "I feel more useful, more authentic than I have in years. Even with everything I've lost, even with the scars, I think I'm happier than I've ever been." The admission hung between them, more intimate than any physical touch. Jeremiah felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling nearby. "I'm glad," he said simply. "You deserve to be happy." "So do you," she replied. "You've given me far more than I expected when I stepped onto that auction block. You've given me a chance to discover who I really am." The storm raged for 3 days, keeping them housebound, but bringing them closer together than all the previous weeks combined. They read aloud from Cassandra's books, taking turns with passages of poetry and philosophy that sparked long discussions. They played cards with a worn deck Jeremiah found in a kitchen drawer. They cooked together, planned improvements to the ranch, and shared stories of their pasts with increasing openness. On the second day, Cassandra asked about the scar that ran along Jeremiah's left forearm, a thin, white line he usually kept hidden beneath his shirt sleeves. "Knife fight," he said quietly, "in a saloon in Denver about 6 years ago. I was young and stupid and thought I had something to prove." "What happened?" "I learned that the best way to win a fight is not to start one in the first place." He looked at her meaningfully. "We all carry scars, Cassandra. Yours just happened to be visible." "Do you regret any of it?" she asked. "The wandering, the fighting, the years before you came here?" Jeremiah considered the question seriously. "No. Everything I did, everything that happened to me led me here, led me to this ranch, to this life, to you." The simple words carried more weight than any flowery declaration of love. Cassandra felt tears prick at her eyes, surprised by the depth of emotion his honesty evoked. On the third day, as the storm finally began to clear, they worked together to dig out the barn and check on the animals. All of the cattle had survived, though several showed signs of stress from the ordeal. The horses were restless from being confined, and Rex had apparently spent the entire storm convinced that he was personally responsible for guarding the entire ranch from the weather. "We make a good team," Jeremiah observed as they finished the morning chores. "Yes," Cassandra agreed, "we do." The simple acknowledgement felt like a milestone. They weren't just surviving their unusual marriage anymore, they were thriving in... During that afternoon brought their first visitors since the storm. A rider approached the house, and Jeremiah recognized Tom Bradley, the rancher who'd bid against him at the auction. Bradley looked older than his 45 years, his face weathered. By wind and sun, his expression perpetually sour. "Kane," Bradley said without dismounting, "heard you had some trouble with the storm." "Nothing we couldn't handle," Jeremiah replied, stepping onto the porch with Cassandra beside him. "Did you lose any cattle?" A few heads drifted south toward the river. Bradley's eyes fixed on Cassandra, and his expression grew speculative. "Heard interesting things about your wife, how she's been working the ranch like a common hand." The words were clearly meant as an insult, but Cassandra stepped forward before Jeremiah could respond. "I work because I choose to, Mr. Bradley. Because this ranch is my home now, and I believe in contributing to its success." Bradley's mouth twisted. "That's not how a proper lady behaves." "Course, I suppose a woman bought at auction can't be expected to know better." The casual cruelty of the comment hit its mark. Jeremiah saw Cassandra flinch as if she'd been struck, saw the old shame and self-doubt flicker across her features. Rage boiled up in his chest, hot and immediate. "You'll apologize to my wife," Jeremiah said, his voice dangerously quiet as he stepped down from the porch. "Now," Bradley laughed, but there was an edge of nervousness to it. "Or what, Cain? Are you going to defend the honor of damaged goods?" Jeremiah's fist connected with Bradley's jaw before the bigger man could react. Bradley toppled from his horse, landing hard in the mud left by the melting snow. He scrambled to his feet, his hand moving toward the gun at his hip, but stopped when he saw Jeremiah's expression. "Next time you come onto my land," Jeremiah said, each word carefully measured, "you'll show respect to my wife, or you won't leave under your own power. Are we clear?" Bradley spat blood into the mud, his eyes ugly with humiliation and rage. "This isn't over, Cain." "Yes, it is," Jeremiah replied, "unless you want to make it something bigger." Bradley mounted his horse with obvious effort, his jaw already swelling. "You'll regret this, both of you." As Bradley rode away, Jeremiah turned to find Cassandra watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I'm sorry," he said. "I shouldn't have lost my temper." "No one has ever defended me like that," she said quietly. "Not once in my entire life." The admission broke something open in Jeremiah's chest. He stepped closer to her, close enough to see the unshed tears in her eyes, close enough to reach out and touch her if he dared. "You're my wife," he said simply, "my partner. No one gets to speak to you that way." "Jeremiah," she whispered, and there was something in her voice, some invitation or question that made his heart race. This time, when she stepped closer, he didn't back away. This time, when she reached up to touch his face, he didn't flinch. And when she rose on her toes to kiss him, soft and tentative and sweet, he kissed her back with all the tenderness and passion he'd been holding in check for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, both looking slightly stunned by the intensity of the connection between them. "Well," Cassandra said, her cheeks flushed pink, "that was unexpected." "Good unexpected or bad unexpected?" Jeremiah asked, his hand still resting lightly on her waist. "Very good unexpectedly," she assured him, smiling in a way that made his heart skip beats. As they walked back to the house together, Jeremiah reflected on how much had changed since that grey October morning when he'd first seen Cassandra on the auction block. He'd thought he was buying a wife out of pity and loneliness. Instead, he'd found a partner who challenged him, supported him, and made him want to be better than he'd ever thought possible. The future stretched ahead of them, full of challenges and uncertainties. But for the first time in his life, Jeremiah wasn't facing it alone, and that, he thought, as Cassandra slipped her hand into his, made all the difference in the world. Spring arrived with a violence that surprised even Jeremiah, who thought he'd seen everything the Colorado wilderness could offer. The winter had been hard but manageable, and he and Cassandra had settled into a rhythm of shared work and growing intimacy that felt as natural as breathing. Their marriage had transformed from a convenient arrangement into something deeper, warmer, more precious than either had dared hope for. But spring brought complications neither of them had anticipated. The first sign of trouble came with the melting snow. What should have been a gradual thaw turned into a torrent when an unexpected warm spell combined with heavy rains to create flooding that threatened every ranch in the valley. The creek that bordered the eastern edge of the Double J became a raging river overnight, carrying away fence posts and threatening to sweep away livestock. "We need to move the cattle to higher ground," Jeremiah said, studying the swollen waterway. From their kitchen window, "All of them, and fast." Cassandra nodded, already reaching for her work clothes. Over the past months, she'd become as capable a ranch hand as any man Jeremiah had ever worked with. More than that, she'd developed an intuitive understanding of the land and the animals that impressed him daily. They spent 3 exhausting days moving cattle, repairing damaged fences, and salvaging what they could from the flood damage. But they weren't the only ones facing disaster. Word came from town that the Miller Ranch had lost 20 head of cattle when their barn collapsed, and the Hendersons were struggling to save their crops from the muddy devastation. "We should help," Cassandra said when they heard about their neighbors' troubles. "The Millers have 3 young children. They can't afford to lose their livelihood." Jeremiah agreed, though he worried about leaving their own ranch vulnerable. They loaded their wagon with supplies and tools and spent the better part of a week helping their neighbors rebuild. It was hard, dirty work, but Cassandra threw herself into it with the same determination she brought to everything else. It was during this time of community crisis that Jeremiah noticed the changes in his wife. Subtle things at first: a pallor to her complexion, a tendency to tire more easily than usual, moments when she'd stop working to press her hand to her stomach with a look of concentration. "Are you feeling all right?" he asked one evening as they returned home from another day of helping with flood repairs. "Just tired," Cassandra replied, but there was something in her voice that didn't quite ring true. 2 weeks later, Dr. Harrison arrived at the Double J Ranch in response to Jeremiah's urgent summons. The elderly physician had been serving the scattered ranches and mining settlements of the region for more than 20 years, and his weathered face had seen every kind of hardship the frontier could inflict. But when he emerged from the bedroom, where he'd been examining Cassandra, his expression was one of barely contained joy rather than concern. "Congratulations, Mr. Kane," he said, pumping Jeremiah's hand vigorously. "You're going to be a father." The words hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. A father. He was going to be a father. The implications crashed over him in waves. The responsibility, the changes it would bring, the vulnerability of bringing a child into their hard-won happiness. "When?" he managed to ask. "Late fall, I'd say. October, maybe early November." Dr. Harrison packed his instruments with practiced efficiency. "Mrs. Kane is in excellent health, strong as a horse. She'll do fine, assuming she takes reasonable precautions." After the doctor left, Jeremiah found Cassandra sitting by their bedroom window, her hands folded over her still flat stomach, her expression unreadable. How do you feel about this?" he asked carefully, sitting beside her on the bed they'd been sharing for the past 2 months. "Terrified," she said honestly. "Excited, overwhelmed." She looked at him with eyes that held a mixture of hope and fear. "How do you feel?" "The same," Jeremiah admitted. I always assumed I'd live alone, never have. A family. This changes everything. Does it change how you feel about me, about us?" The question surprised him. How could it? If anything, it makes me love you more. The word hung between them, spoken aloud for the first time. Love, such a simple word for something so complex, so life-altering. "I love you too," Cassandra whispered, and the admission felt like a gift beyond price. But their happiness was shadowed by practical concerns. A baby would mean additional expenses, more vulnerability, new responsibilities that would stretch their resources. Jeremiah threw himself into work with renewed determination, expanding their cattle herd, improving their infrastructure, preparing for the future in every way he could imagine. It was during one of these preparation efforts that the second complication of spring made itself known. Jeremiah was repairing the roof of the barn when he spotted riders approaching from the south. 3 men on horseback, moving with the deliberate pace of people who weren't in a hurry because they didn't expect resistance. As they drew closer, Jeremiah recognized the lead rider and felt his blood turn cold. Tom Bradley, flanked by 2 men. Jeremiah didn't recognize, but whose bearing suggested they were hired muscle rather than ranchers. "Cassandra!" Jeremiah called toward the house. "Go inside and stay there." She appeared in the doorway, took one look at the approaching riders, and disappeared back into the house. But Jeremiah knew she'd be watching from the window. Probably. With the shotgun, they kept loaded by the door. Bradley and his companions rode into the yard and dismounted without invitation. The 2 strangers were cut from the same cloth, hard-faced men with the look of those who solve problems with violence. Their hands rested casually near their weapons, a subtle but unmistakable threat. "Kane," Bradley said, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who held the upper hand. "We need to talk." "About what?" Jeremiah replied, climbing down from the barn roof, but keeping his hammer in his hand. "About your wife, about the irregular circumstances of your marriage, about certain debts that have come to light." "I don't know what you're talking about." Bradley smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "See, that's where you're wrong. Turns out your Cassandra has quite an interesting past. Debts in Denver. Significant debts. The kind that don't just disappear because a woman gets married and moves to Colorado." Jeremiah felt ice forming in his stomach. "What kind of debts?" "Medical bills, mostly. Seems the treatment for those burn scars was expensive. Very expensive. And when she couldn't pay..." Bradley shrugged. "Well, let's just say there are people in Denver who don't like being cheated." "She's not in Denver anymore," Jeremiah pointed out. "No, but debts have a way of following people, especially when those people try to escape them by entering into fraudulent marriages." Bradley's smile widened. "You see, Kane, there's some question about whether your wife was legally free to marry you at all. Turns out she was already contracted to another man in Denver, a man who paid good money for exclusive rights to her companionship." The words hit Jeremiah like physical blows. Contract marriage, debt bondage. The implications were staggering. If Bradley was telling the truth, then Cassandra hadn't been free to marry him, which would make their entire relationship a legal fiction. "I don't believe you," Jeremiah said, but doubt was already gnawing at him. "Don't take my word for it," Bradley replied, pulling a folded document from his coat. "Here's the contract, signed and witnessed. Cassandra Whitmore, bound to Mr. Franklin. Morse of Denver for a period of 3 years, with option for renewal. She had 2 years left on her contract when she ran off to play bride at our little auction." Jeremiah took the document with numb fingers. The legal language was dense and complex, but the basic terms were clear enough. Cassandra had indeed signed a contract that bound her to this Morse character for 3 years. The date was from just 6 months before the auction. "Even if this is real," Jeremiah said slowly, "she's my wife now. The law recognizes our marriage." "Does it?" Bradley asked. "When the marriage was entered into fraudulently, when the bride was already legally bound to another man? I think you'll find that the territorial courts take a dim view of such irregularities." The threat was clear now. Bradley wasn't just trying to cause trouble, he was trying to destroy their marriage entirely, to take Cassandra away from him through legal manipulation. "What do you want?" Jeremiah asked bluntly. "Simple. Your wife returns to Denver to fulfill her contractual obligations. You get an annulment and move on with your life. Nobody gets hurt, and we all pretend this unfortunate misunderstanding never happened. And if I refuse," Bradley gestured to his companions, "then we enforce the contract through other means. Mr. Morse was quite specific about wanting his property returned intact, but he didn't say anything about you remaining intact." Rage boiled up in Jeremiah's chest, hot and immediate. The casual way Bradley spoke about Cassandra as property, the threats against him, the entire sordid attempt to destroy the life they'd built together, it all combined into a fury that threatened. to overwhelm his judgment. But before he could act on that fury, the front door of the house opened, and Cassandra stepped out onto the porch. She was pale but composed, her chin lifted with the dignity that had first caught Jeremiah's attention at the auction. "Hello, Tom," she said quietly. "I wondered when you'd make your move." Bradley's smile faltered slightly at her calm response. "Cassandra, I trust you heard our conversation." "Enough of it." She walked down the porch steps and across the yard to stand beside Jeremiah. "The contract you're waving around is indeed real, as are the debts, as is the fact that I ran away from Denver rather than honor an agreement I never should have made." "Then, you'll come back with us," Bradley said, quietly, without making this more difficult than it needs to be. "No," Cassandra replied simply. "I won't. You don't have a choice. The law, Cassandra interrupted, also recognizes that contracts entered into under duress are invalid. I signed that agreement because I was desperate, injured, and told it was my only option to avoid debtor's prison. I was coerced into it by men who took advantage of my situation." "Prove it," Bradley sneered. "I intend to." Cassandra's voice was steady, but Jeremiah could see the tremor in her hands. "But more importantly, I'm carrying Jeremiah's child. That makes any claim on me by Mr. Morse considerably more complicated." The announcement hit Bradley like a slap. His two companions exchanged glances, suddenly looking less confident about their mission. Kidnapping a pregnant woman would bring down a level of law enforcement attention that none of them wanted. "This isn't over," Bradley said finally, but the bluster had gone out of him. "Yes, it is," Jeremiah replied, stepping forward. "And if you or your friends come onto my land again, if you threaten my wife or my child again, I'll kill you." "That's not a threat, Bradley. That's a promise." The three men mounted their horses and rode away, but Jeremiah knew they'd be back. Men like Bradley didn't give up easily, especially when their pride was involved, and the legal complications Cassandra's past had revealed wouldn't disappear just because they'd faced down the immediate threat. "We need to talk," Jeremiah said quietly as the riders disappeared over the hill. "Yes," Cassandra agreed, her composure finally cracking. "We do." They walked to the house in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. The happiness of the morning, the joy of their shared pregnancy, the simple contentment of their life together. All of it now overshadowed by the revelation of Cassandra's past and the very real threat it posed to their future. Inside the kitchen, they sat across from each other at the table where they'd shared so many meals, so many conversations, so many quiet moments of growing intimacy. Now the space between them felt vast, filled with secrets and lies, and the terrible uncertainty of what came next. "Tell me," Jeremiah said simply. "All of it, from the beginning." And Cassandra, her hands folded protectively over her stomach, began to speak. The story that emerged was one of desperation and coercion, of a young woman trapped by circumstances, beyond her control and forced to make choices no one should have to make. It was also a story of courage and determination, of someone who'd refused to accept defeat even when defeat seemed inevitable. By the time she finished, Jeremiah understood exactly why she'd ended up on that auction block in Millbrook. He also understood that their fight for the life they'd built together was just beginning. "What do we do now?" Cassandra asked when the telling was done. Jeremiah reached across the table and took her hands in his. "Now we fight together, for our marriage, for our child, for the life we've built, whatever it takes." The words were a promise and a declaration of war all at once. Their happiness had been threatened, their future cast into doubt. But they weren't the same people who'd met at that auction 6 months ago. They were stronger now, bound together by love and shared purpose, and they weren't going down without a fight. The next morning brought an unexpected ally in the form of Judge William Crawford, the territorial circuit judge who made his rounds. and through the scattered settlements of Colorado twice a year. Crawford was a lean man in his 60s with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. Unlike many frontier judges who dispensed rough justice with little regard for legal niceties, Crawford was a Harvard-educated lawyer who'd come west after the war and built a reputation for fairness and thorough attention to the law. "Mr. Kane," Crawford said, accepting a cup of coffee from Cassandra with obvious appreciation, "I understand you're facing some legal implications regarding your marriage." Word traveled fast in small communities, and Jeremiah wasn't surprised. That news of Bradley's threats had reached the judge. What did surprise him was Crawford's willingness to involve himself in what could easily be dismissed as a private dispute. "That's right, Your Honor," Jeremiah replied carefully. "My wife apparently had some previous obligations that weren't disclosed at the time of our marriage." Crawford studied Cassandra with the keen attention of a man accustomed to reading people. "Mrs. Kane, I'd like to hear your version of events. From the beginning, if you please." What followed was the most thorough legal examination Jeremiah had ever witnessed. Crawford questioned Cassandra for more than 2 hours, going over every detail of her situation in Denver, the circumstances that led to her signing the contract with Franklin Morse, and the events that brought her to the Millbrook auction. His questions were probing but not unkind, and Jeremiah could see him building a case in his mind as he gathered information. "The contract you signed with Mr. Morse," Crawford said finally, studying the document Bradley had left behind. "Was it explained to you in detail before you signed it?" "No," Cassandra replied. "I was told it was a standard employment agreement. I was recovering from my injuries, heavily medicated, and desperate for any solution to my debts. They presented it as temporary work that would allow me to pay off what I owed." "And the nature of the work?" Cassandra's cheeks flushed, but her voice remained steady. "I was told I would be a companion to Mr. Morse. The specific expectations weren't made clear until after I'd signed." Crawford nodded grimly. "Deceptive contracting practices, and the terms of repayment." "Impossible," Cassandra said flatly. "My supposed wages were offset by charges for room, board, clothing, medical care, and various fees that weren't disclosed initially. The debt actually increased rather than decreased over time." "Debt peonage," Crawford muttered, making notes. "Highly illegal under territorial law." He looked up at Jeremiah. "Mr. Kane, were you aware of any of this when you bid at the auction?" "No, sir. I bid because—" Jeremiah struggled to find words that wouldn't sound foolish. "Because she seemed to need help, and because something about her impressed me." "An honest answer," Crawford observed, with what might have been approval. "Mrs. Kane, you're certain about the pregnancy?" "Yes, Your Honor. Dr. Harrison confirmed it just 2 days ago." Crawford leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he considered the situation. "This is quite a tangle you've found yourselves in. Legally speaking, there are several issues at play. First, the validity of your marriage, which hinges on whether Mrs. Kane was free to enter into it. Second, the enforceability of the contract with Mr. Morse, which appears to contain several provisions that violate territorial statutes. Third, the question of interstate jurisdiction, since the original contract was signed in Denver." "What does that mean for us?" Jeremiah asked. "It means," Crawford said, "that we need to act quickly and decisively. Mr. Bradley's threats suggest that Mr. Morse's representatives won't wait for the legal system to sort this out. They'll try to take matters into their own hands." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses reached them through the kitchen window. But these weren't the 3 riders from the day before. This was a larger group, at least. 6 men, riding with the purposeful advance of a military unit. "Stay inside," Crawford ordered sharply, his mild demeanor evaporating as he moved to the window. "Mr. Kane, are you armed?" "Yes, sir." Jeremiah reached for the rifle he kept behind the kitchen door. "Good. Mrs. Kane, get upstairs and stay away." "From the windows. I'm not hiding while my husband faces danger," Cassandra said firmly. "You're carrying a child," Crawford replied, without taking his eyes off the approaching riders. "That child needs protection above all else." The riders pulled up in the yard, and Jeremiah counted 8 men total. Bradley and his 2 companions from the day before, plus 5 others who had the look of professional gunmen. At their head rode a man Jeremiah didn't recognize, impeccably dressed, despite the dust of travel, with the soft look of someone who'd spent his life in cities rather than on horseback. "That would be Franklin Morse," Crawford said grimly. "I've heard of him. Owns several establishments in Denver. Not a man who likes to lose his investments." The group dismounted and approached the house with the confidence of men who expected to get their way. Morse walked slightly ahead of the others, his expensive clothes and polished boots marking him as clearly out of place on a Colorado ranch. "Mr. Kane," Morse called out as he reached the porch, "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Crawford stepped onto the porch before Jeremiah could respond, his presence immediately changing the dynamic of the confrontation. "Mr. Morse, I presume I'm Judge William Crawford, and you're currently on my circuit. I suggest you choose your next words very carefully." Morse's confidence faltered slightly at the unexpected presence of a territorial judge. "Your Honor, I wasn't aware you were involved in this matter." "I'm involved now," Crawford replied, coldly. "What's your business here?" "I've come to collect my property," Morse said, regaining some of his composure. "The woman inside this house is bound to me by legal contract. Her marriage to Mr. Kane is invalid, and I demand her immediate return." "Do you now?" Crawford's voice carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "And I suppose you have documentation to support these claims?" Morse gestured to Bradley, who produced another copy of the contract. Crawford examined it carefully, taking his time while tension built in the yard. "Interesting document," Crawford said finally. "Tell me, Mr. Morse, are you familiar with the territorial statutes regarding involuntary servitude?" "This isn't servitude," Morse protested. "It's a legitimate business arrangement." "Is it? Let's see. A woman signs a contract while injured and under medical influence, agreeing to terms that weren't fully disclosed, with a debt structure designed to ensure she can never repay what she owes. That sounds very much like debt peonage to me, which has been illegal in Colorado Territory since 1865. "The contract was signed in Denver," Bradley interjected. "Colorado law doesn't apply, doesn't it?" Crawford smiled coldly. "The Supreme Court ruled in Client versus United States that debt peonage is a federal crime, prohibited under the 13th Amendment. That makes it illegal everywhere in the United States, including Denver." Morse's face was growing red with frustration. "Legal technicalities aside, that woman owes me money, significant money. I have a right to collect what's owed." "Through legal channels, yes," Crawford agreed. "Through intimidation and threats of violence, absolutely not." His eyes swept over the assembled gunmen. "I count 8 armed men on this property without invitation. That constitutes trespassing at minimum, possibly conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Now, see here," Morse began. "No, you see here," Crawford interrupted, his voice cutting like a blade. "Mrs. Kane's marriage to Mr. Kane is legal and valid under territorial law. Any debts she may have incurred prior to that marriage are her responsibility to address through proper legal channels, not grounds for nullifying a lawful union. If you have financial claims against her, you're welcome to file suit in the appropriate court." "And if we choose not to wait for the courts?" one of Morse's hired men asked, his hand resting on his gun. Crawford stepped down from the porch, moving with surprising speed for a man his age. "Then you'll answer me," he said quietly, "and I guarantee you won't like that conversation." The standoff stretched taut as wire. 8 armed men facing down one judge and one rancher. But Crawford's presence changed everything. He represented not just the law, but the entire territorial government. Shooting a federal judge would bring down consequences that even Morse couldn't escape. "This isn't over," Morse said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "I'll file charges, seek extradition, use every legal avenue available. She'll return to Denver one way or another." "You're welcome to try," Crawford replied mildly. "Just make sure you do it through proper channels. Any more visits like this one, and I'll have you arrested for conspiracy and intimidation." The group mounted their horses and rode away, but their departure felt more like a tactical retreat than a permanent victory. Morse wasn't a man who gave up easily, and the legal threats he'd made were very real. "How much trouble are we in?" Jeremiah asked, as they watched the riders disappear. "Considerable," Crawford admitted. "Morse has resources and connections in Denver. He'll file charges, probably claim that Mrs. Kane stole money from him when she left. He'll petition for extradition, argue that Colorado has no jurisdiction over crimes committed in Denver." "But you said our marriage was valid," Cassandra said, joining them on the porch now that the immediate danger had passed. "It is under territorial law, but if Denver issues a warrant for your arrest, that complicates matters significantly." Crawford studied her with thoughtful eyes. "Tell me, Mrs. Kane, do you have any evidence of the deceptive practices used when you signed that contract? Letters, witnesses, anything that could support your claim of coercion?" Cassandra was quiet for a long moment, thinking. "There might be something," she said finally. "Dr. Whitman, the physician who treated my burns, expressed concerns about my mental state when the contract was presented. He said I wasn't in any condition to make important decisions, and there was a nurse, Margaret Sullivan, who witnessed some of the conversations about the contract terms. If we could get statements from them," Crawford mused. "Dr. Whitman died last winter," Cassandra said quietly. "But Margaret might still be in Denver. She was upset about the whole situation and said it reminded her of the slavery she'd seen in the South before the war." "That could be crucial testimony," Crawford said. "The question is whether we can get it before Morse acts." "I'll go to Denver," Jeremiah said suddenly. "I'll find Margaret Sullivan, get her statement, whatever else we need." "Absolutely not," Cassandra said firmly. "Denver is Morse's territory. He'll have you arrested the moment you set foot in the city." "She's right," Crawford agreed. "But there might be another way. I have contacts in Denver, other judges, lawyers who owe me favors. Let me send some telegrams, see what I can arrange." Over the next 3 days, Crawford worked tirelessly on their behalf, sending and receiving telegrams, consulting law books, building a case that might protect them from Morse's legal assault. Meanwhile, Jeremiah and Cassandra tried to maintain some semblance of normal life, though the threat hanging over them made every moment feel precious and precarious. On the 4th day, Crawford returned from town with news that was both encouraging and troubling. "I've located Margaret Sullivan," he announced. "She's still in Denver, working at St. Joseph's Hospital. She remembers the situation clearly and is willing to provide a sworn statement about the circumstances of the contract." "That's wonderful," Cassandra said, relief evident in her voice. "There's more," Crawford continued. "I've also discovered that you're not the only woman who's been victimized by Morse's operation. There are at least 3 others who signed similar contracts under questionable circumstances. If we can build a pattern of deceptive practices—" "What's the bad news?" Jeremiah asked, sensing there was more to come. Crawford's expression grew grave. "Morse has filed charges in Denver just as I expected. Theft, breach of contract, flight to avoid debt. He also petitioned the territorial governor for extradition. If that petition is approved, they could force me to return to Denver." Cassandra finished. "Yes. And once you're back in Denver, under Morse's influence, fighting the charges becomes much more difficult." "How long do we have?" Jeremiah asked. "The extradition process takes time, especially when there are legal challenges to be made. I'd say weeks, maybe a month or 2 if we're lucky." Crawford looked directly at Cassandra. But we need to be prepared for the possibility that legal remedies might not be enough. The implication hung in the air between them. If the law couldn't protect them, they might have to take matters into their own hands, flee Colorado territory, start over somewhere beyond Morse's reach. The thought of abandoning the ranch, the life they'd built together, the community they'd become part of, was almost unbearable. "There's one more thing," Crawford said quietly. "I've been in touch with Marshal Stevens in Denver. He's sympathetic to your situation. Morse's operation has been on his radar for some time, but he's never had enough evidence to move against it. If we can provide that evidence, Morse could be the one facing charges instead of me," Cassandra said, understanding. "Immediately." "Exactly. But it would require you to testify, to put yourself at risk by going to Denver." "No," Jeremiah said immediately. "It's too dangerous. Morse has too much power there, too many people in his pocket. It might be our only chance," Cassandra replied quietly. "If we can stop him permanently, we'll never have to worry about him again." The decision they faced was an impossible one. Play it safe and hope the legal system protected them, or take enormous risks for the chance to end the threat forever. Either choice could destroy everything they'd built together, but as they talked long into the night, weighing options and considering consequences, one thing became clear. Whatever they decided, they would face it together. The quiet cowboy and the scarred bride had found something worth fighting for, and they weren't going to let anyone take it away without a battle. The morning would bring new challenges, new dangers, new choices that would determine the shape of their future. But tonight they held each other close and drew strength from the knowledge that love had given them something worth defending against any threat. The decision came at dawn, delivered by a breathless messenger who'd ridden through the night from Millbrook. Marshal Stevens had sent word from Denver. 3 more women had come forward with evidence against Morse, but they needed Cassandra's testimony to make the charges stick. The window of opportunity was narrow, perhaps only days before Morse's political connections could suppress the investigation. "It's a trap," Jeremiah said flatly, crumpling the telegram in his fist. "He wants to get you back to Denver, where he has control." "Maybe," Cassandra replied, but her voice carried a note of determination that Jeremiah had learned to recognize. "Or maybe it's our only chance to end this permanently." Judge Crawford arrived an hour later, having ridden hard from town after receiving his own copy of the marshal's message. His usually composed demeanor showed cracks of exhaustion and worry. "Marshal Stevens is trustworthy," he said without preamble. "I've known him for 5 years, and he's one of the few honest lawmen in Denver, but that doesn't mean the situation isn't dangerous." "What exactly is he proposing?" Jeremiah asked. Crawford spread out several documents on their kitchen table. "A coordinated operation. Stevens has been building a case against Morse for months, but he's been missing key evidence. With Cassandra's testimony and the statements from the other women, he believes he can arrest Morse and shut down his entire operation." "And if something goes wrong?" Cassandra asked quietly. "If something goes wrong, you could end up in Morse's hands with no legal protection," Crawford admitted. "Stevens can offer some safeguards, but his authority has limits." The weight of the decision pressed down on them like the summer heat. Jeremiah studied his wife's face, seeing the conflict there, the desire to end the threat forever, warring with practical fears for her safety and that of their unborn child. "There's another consideration," Cassandra said finally. "The other, women who came forward. They're taking enormous risks by testifying against Morse. If I don't support them, if their cases fail because I was too afraid to act—" "That's not your responsibility," Jeremiah protested, "isn't it?" Her hand moved, unconsciously to her stomach. "This child we're carrying, what kind of world do we want to bring them into? One where men like Morse can prey on desperate women with impunity, or one where we fought back when we had the chance?" The argument continued through the morning. But Jeremiah could see the resolution hardening in Cassandra's eyes. She'd made her decision. Now she was working to convince him to accept it. "If we're going to do this," he said finally, "we do it right. Maximum protection, multiple escape routes, and I'm coming with you." "Jeremiah, you can't." "I can and I will," he interrupted with quiet firmness. "You're my wife, carrying my child. I'm not sending you into danger alone." Crawford nodded approvingly. "Actually, that might work in our favor. A married couple traveling together will draw less attention than a single woman. And Stevens could use another reliable witness to the intimidation tactics Morse has been using." They spent the rest of the day planning every detail of the journey to Denver. Crawford would travel with them, using his judicial authority to provide some legal protection. They would enter the city quietly, meet with Marshal Stevens at a predetermined location, and limit their exposure to the minimum time necessary for Cassandra to provide her testimony. "What about the ranch?" Cassandra asked as they prepared to leave the next morning. "Sam Miller owes me a favor from when we helped with his flood damage," Jeremiah replied. "He'll keep an eye on things while we're gone." The journey to Denver took 2 days of hard riding, and with each mile, Jeremiah felt the knot in his stomach tighten. They were entering enemy territory, placing themselves at the mercy of a legal system that might not protect them if things went wrong. Denver had grown since Jeremiah's last visit years earlier. The mining boom had brought money and people, transforming what had been a rough frontier town into something approaching a real city. Gas lamps lined the main streets, and the sound of construction echoed from every direction as new buildings rose to meet the demands of prosperity. But beneath the veneer of progress, Jeremiah could sense the undercurrents of corruption and vice that had always plagued boomtowns. This was Morse's territory, where money bought influence and influence purchased protection from the law. They met Marshal Stevens at a small hotel on the outskirts of the city, far from the more fashionable districts where Morse conducted his business. Stevens was a lean man in his 40s, with prematurely grey hair and the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much of humanity's darker nature. "Mrs. Kane," he said, rising as they entered the modest hotel room he'd secured for the meeting. "Thank you for coming. I know the risks you're taking." "What's the situation?" Crawford asked without preamble. Stevens spread out a map of the city on the room's small table. "We have 3 other women prepared to testify: Sarah Bennett, Ellen Murphy, and Rachel Collins. All signed contracts similar to Mrs. Kane's, all under questionable circumstances. But Morse's lawyers are already working to discredit them, claiming they're disgruntled former employees with grudges." "And my testimony changes that how?" Cassandra asked. "Because you're different," Stevens explained. "You're married to a respectable rancher, you have standing in the community, and most importantly, you escaped before Morse could fully compromise you. Your testimony establishes the pattern, while coming from someone who can't be dismissed as easily." "When do we do this?" Jeremiah asked. "Tomorrow morning. I've arranged for a preliminary hearing before Judge Morrison. He's one of the few judges in the city who can't be bought. If we can get formal charges filed, Morse loses much of his ability to operate freely." That evening, as they waited in their hotel room for the next day's proceedings, Cassandra seemed unusually quiet. She sat by the window, watching the busy street below, her hand resting on her stomach in the gesture that had become habitual. "Having second thoughts?" Jeremiah asked gently. "No," she replied. "I'm thinking about the woman I was 6 months ago. Desperate, ashamed, convinced that I deserved whatever happened to me because of my scars. That woman never would have found the courage to fight back." "What changed?" She turned from the window to look at him, and in her eyes he saw all the love and strength that had grown between them. "You did. This life we've built did. For the first time in my life, I have something worth fighting for." The preliminary hearing the next morning took place in a courthouse that reeked of tobacco and Unwashed bodies. Judge Morrison was an elderly man with keen eyes and a reputation for fairness that had somehow survived decades of frontier justice. The courtroom was nearly empty, except for the principals, a few reporters, and several well-dressed men who were obviously Morse's representatives. Cassandra's testimony was detailed and devastating. She spoke calmly and clearly about the circumstances of her contract, the deceptive practices used to secure her signature, and the impossible debt structure designed to ensure perpetual servitude. When Morse's lawyer tried to discredit her, suggesting she was a bitter woman seeking revenge, Crawford objected with such legal precision that the attorney was left sputtering. "Mrs. Kane," Judge Morrison said when her testimony concluded, "you understand that by making these accusations, you're opening yourself to potential charges of defamation if they prove false?" "I understand, Your Honor. Everything I've said is true." The other women testified with similar courage, their stories, creating a pattern of deception and coercion that even Morse's expensive lawyers couldn't explain away. By noon, Judge Morrison had heard enough. "Based on the testimony presented," he announced, "I find sufficient cause to issue warrants for the arrest of Franklin Morse and his associates on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and violation of federal anti-peonage statutes. Marshal Stevens, you may proceed with the arrests." The courtroom erupted as Morse's representatives rushed to confer with their client. But Morse himself seemed remarkably calm, as if he'd expected this outcome and had already prepared for it. "This isn't over," he said quietly as Stevens approached with handcuffs. "I have friends in high places, Mrs. Kane, friends who don't appreciate having their business arrangements disrupted." "Your business arrangements are illegal," Stevens replied curtly, "and your friends won't be able to help you from a federal prison." As Morse was led away in chains, Jeremiah felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. The immediate threat was over. Cassandra was safe, their marriage was secure, and the man who'd terrorized her was finally facing justice. But their victory celebration was short-lived. 2 hours later, as they prepared to leave Denver, a young man burst into their hotel room with news that turned their triumph to ash. "Judge Morrison's been shot," the messenger gasped. "Gunned down outside his home an hour ago. He's alive, but barely." "And the warrants?" Crawford asked, his face pale. "Voided. Morrison never had a chance to sign them officially. Morse's lawyers are claiming the preliminary hearing was invalid, that he was acting under duress." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Without Judge Morrison's signature, the warrants were worthless. Morse would be released, the charges dropped, and all their testimony rendered meaningless. "We need to leave," Stevens said urgently. "Now. Morrison's shooting wasn't random, it was a message. You're all in danger." They packed quickly and prepared to flee. But as they reached the hotel's rear exit, they found their way blocked by 3 armed men. More of Morse's hired guns, positioned to prevent their escape. "Going somewhere?" one of them asked with a cold smile. "The front exit's blocked too," Stevens reported grimly after checking. "They have us surrounded." Jeremiah checked his revolver, counting bullets and considering their options. They were trapped in a hotel room with nowhere to run and enemies closing in from all sides. The legal victory they thought they'd won had evaporated, leaving them more vulnerable than ever. "The roof," Cassandra said suddenly. "There's a fire outside the window. If we can reach the building next door." It was a desperate plan, fraught with danger, especially for a pregnant woman. But it was their only chance. "I'll go first," Jeremiah said, moving toward the window. "Test the route. Make sure it's safe." "No time," Stevens replied, listening to footsteps in the hallway outside their door. "They're coming. We go together, or not at all." The window opened onto a narrow fire escape that clung precariously to the building's brick wall. 4 stories below, the alley was filled with shadows and the promise of broken bones for anyone who fell. But the building next door was only 6. Feet away, its roof accessible if they could make the jump. Mrs. Kane goes first, Crawford said firmly. She's the lightest, and we need to know the route is passable. I can't ask her to, Jeremiah began. You're not asking, Cassandra interrupted, already climbing through the window. I'm choosing. What followed was the longest few minutes of Jeremiah's life. Cassandra moved carefully but steadily across the fire escape, testing each step before committing her full weight. The metal groaned ominously, but it held. When she reached the edge of the building, she paused only briefly before making the leap to the adjacent roof. She landed safely, turning to beckon the others across. One by one, they made the dangerous crossing. Crawford moved with surprising agility for his age, while Stevens brought up the rear, his gun drawn in case Morse's men discovered their escape route. They were halfway across the second building's roof when the hotel room window behind them exploded outward in a shower of glass and gunfire. Morse's men had discovered their escape, and bullets began whining through the air around them. The stairs, Jeremiah shouted, pointing toward a rooftop access door. Move! They raced across the remaining distance as bullets chipped brick and shattered tiles around them. The access door was locked, but Stevens shot off the handle and they plunged into the building's dark stairwell. 4 flights down, gasping and stumbling in the darkness, they emerged into an alley behind a bakery. The owner, startled by their sudden appearance, opened his mouth to shout, but Crawford quickly showed his judicial credentials. "Official business," he said tersely. "We need to use your back door." Minutes later, they were mounting fresh horses that Stevens had arranged, riding hard out of Denver as the sun set behind the mountains. They'd escaped Morse's immediate trap, but they'd also lost their best chance to end his threat permanently. "What now?" Cassandra asked, as they put distance between themselves and the city. "Now we disappear," Stevens replied grimly. "Morse won't give up easily, and with Judge Morrison out of commission, the legal system can't protect you." "You mean we run?" Jeremiah said. "I mean you survive. Find somewhere Morse can't reach, start over, live quiet lives until this blows over." The thought of abandoning their ranch, their life, everything they'd built together was almost unbearable. But as they rode through the darkening landscape, Jeremiah realized they might not have any other choice. The fight for their future was far from over. If anything, it had just become more desperate, more dangerous, and more uncertain than ever before. But they were alive, they were together, and as long as that remained true, there was still hope. The quiet cowboy and his scarred bride had survived their first real test. Now they faced an even greater challenge, finding a way to build a life together, while the shadows of the past pursued them across the vast wilderness of the American West. 6 months later, in the remote mountain valley they'd found 200 miles north of the Double J Ranch, Cassandra stood at the window of their small cabin, watching Jeremiah work with the horses in the meadow below. Her pregnancy was now clearly visible, and the child they carried had begun to move with increasing frequency, as if eager to join the world they were fighting so hard to create. The valley was beautiful in its isolation, a hidden pocket of green, surrounded by towering peaks, accessible only through a narrow canyon that could be easily defended. They'd found it after weeks of searching, guided by an old prospector who'd taken pity on their desperate situation. It wasn't the life they'd planned, but it was safe, peaceful, and theirs. "Any regrets?" Marshal Stevens asked from behind her. He'd stayed with them after Denver, his own life threatened by his association with their case. The 3 of them had become an unlikely family of sorts, bound together by shared danger and mutual dependence. About leaving the ranch? Cassandra considered the question seriously. Sometimes, but not about the choice to fight. Even if we lost everything else, we proved that Morse couldn't break us. The ranch isn't lost, Stevens reminded her. Judge Crawford is still working to clear the legal complications. Once Morse's influence is broken— If it's broken, Cassandra corrected. Judge Morrison survived his wounds, but he's retired from the bench. The other judges in Denver are either corrupt or too frightened to act. Morse is still free, still operating. Through the window, they watched Jeremiah approach the cabin, his movements showing the easy confidence that had first attracted her attention at the auction. He'd adapted to their exile better than she'd expected, finding peace in the mountain solitude that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with him in the first place. "Company coming," he announced as he entered the cabin. 2 riders moving fast from the south. Stevens was immediately alert, his hand moving to his weapon. They'd had no visitors in their mountain refuge, and unexpected arrivals could mean Morse had finally tracked them down. "Can you identify them?" Stevens asked, moving to the rifle rack near the door. Jeremiah studied the approaching figures through a telescope. "One of them looks like Judge Crawford, and someone I don't recognize." Relief flooded through Cassandra. Crawford had been their lifeline to the outside world, bringing supplies and news during his irregular visits. But he'd never brought anyone else to their hidden valley. The riders reached the cabin an hour later, Crawford's familiar figure accompanied by a woman Cassandra didn't recognize. Middle-aged, well-dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Mrs. Kane, Mr. Kane," Crawford said as he dismounted. "I'd like you to meet Catherine Morrison, Judge Morrison's daughter." The woman stepped forward with a determined expression that reminded Cassandra immediately of her father. "Mrs. Kane, I've come to offer you an opportunity for justice." "What kind of opportunity?" Stevens asked suspiciously. Catherine Morrison's smile was sharp as a blade. "The kind that involves Franklin Morse finally getting what he deserves." They gathered around the cabin's small table as Catherine Morrison laid out documents that made Cassandra's heart race with sudden hope. "My father survived the assassination attempt," she began, "but it opened his eyes to just how deeply Morse's corruption has spread through Denver's legal system. Before he retired, he made certain arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" Crawford asked. "Federal arrangements. The territorial government may be compromised, but Washington takes a dim view of attempts to murder federal judges. The Attorney General has authorized a special prosecutor to investigate Morse's entire operation." "And," Jeremiah prompted, "and they need witnesses. The other women who testified have disappeared, paid off, threatened, or worse. You're the only credible witness left, Mrs. Kane." Cassandra felt the familiar weight of decision settling on her shoulders. "What exactly are you asking me to do? Testify before a federal grand jury? Help us build a case that Morse's lawyers can't escape, no matter how many judges they own?" Catherine's eyes held the same determination Cassandra had seen in her father. "We have a new angle now, the attempted murder of a federal judge. That's a capital crime, and we have evidence linking it directly to Morse." "Evidence?" Stevens asked sharply. "The gunman we caught sang like a canary when he realized he was facing the gallows. He gave us names, dates, payments, everything we needed to connect Morse to the shooting." Catherine spread out more documents. "But we still need your testimony about the original crimes to establish the motive." "Where would this happen?" Jeremiah asked. "San Francisco. Neutral territory. Federal court. Maximum security. Morse's influence doesn't reach that far west." Cassandra exchanged glances with Jeremiah, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. Another journey, another risk, another chance to end the threat hanging over their lives. "When?" she asked quietly. 2 weeks. I have a federal escort waiting in Colorado Springs, marshals who answer directly to Washington, not to any local authority that Morse might have compromised. And if this fails like the last time—" Catherine Morrison's expression grew hard. "Then Franklin Morse will hang for attempted murder, even if he escapes the other charges. Either way, his operation is finished." That night, as they lay in their bed listening to the mountain wind, Cassandra and Jeremiah talked through the decision that would shape their future. "I can't ask you to risk yourself again," Jeremiah said quietly. "Not with the baby coming." "You're not asking? I'm choosing." Cassandra's hand found his in the darkness. "We could stay hidden here forever, always looking over our shoulders, always wondering when Morse might find us, or we can finish this once and for all. And if something goes wrong, then at least we'll know we tried, that we didn't let fear make our choices for us." The journey to San Francisco took 3 weeks, traveling with the federal escort Catherine Morrison had promised. The marshals were professional and competent, men who understood the stakes and the dangers involved. But even so, Cassandra felt vulnerable in a way she hadn't since those first terrifying days after the Denver escape. San Francisco was a revelation, a bustling metropolis that dwarfed even Denver's recent growth. Ships crowded the harbor, bringing goods and people from around the world, while the city climbed impossibly steep hills in a display of human ambition that took Cassandra's breath away. The federal courthouse was an imposing building of stone and steel designed to project the power and permanence of justice. Inside, the grand jury proceedings were unlike anything Cassandra had experienced before. No hostile lawyers, no public gallery, just 12 citizens listening carefully as she told her story once again. This time, though, her testimony was part of a larger case that had been building for months. The federal prosecutors had traced Morse's operation across state lines, connecting it to similar enterprises in other cities, building a picture of organized criminality that reached far beyond what Cassandra had experienced personally. "Mrs. Kane," the lead prosecutor asked, "when you signed the contract with Mr. Morse, did you understand that you were entering into what amounted to indentured servitude?" "No, sir. I was told it was temporary employment that would allow me to pay off medical debts." "And the actual terms of your service, were these explained to you clearly?" "Not until after I'd signed. The document I saw initially was different from the final contract." "Different how?" "The debt structure was altered to include charges I'd never seen before. Room, board, clothing, medical care, all at inflated prices that made it impossible to reduce what I owed." The questions continued for hours, building a detailed picture of deception and coercion that left the grand jury visibly disturbed. When other witnesses testified about the assassination attempt on Judge Morrison, connecting it directly to Morse's efforts to escape justice, the pattern became clear. 3 days later, the grand jury returned indictments on 12 federal charges, including conspiracy, fraud, violation of anti-peonage statutes, and attempted murder of a federal judge. Warrants were issued for Morse and 6 associates, with federal marshals already moving to make arrests. "It's over," Catherine Morrison told them as they left the courthouse. Even if Morse's lawyers managed to fight some of the charges, the attempted murder conviction alone will put him away for life. "And the other women?" Cassandra asked. "The ones who disappeared?" "We're working to locate them, offering federal protection if they're willing to testify. With Morse in custody, they might finally feel safe enough to come forward." The telegram arrived 2 days later, while they were preparing to return to Colorado. Franklin Morse had been arrested in Denver, along with 4 of his associates. His lawyers were already claiming innocence, but the evidence was overwhelming. The reign of terror that had forced Cassandra onto that auction block was finally ending. "What now?" Jeremiah asked as they boarded the train that would take them home. "Now we reclaim our life," Cassandra replied, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "We go back to the ranch, raise our child, and build the future we've been fighting for." The Double J Ranch looked exactly as they'd left it, maintained faithfully by Sam Miller and his family. The cattle had thrived in their absence. The building stood solid and welcoming, and Rex bounded toward them with the exuberant joy of a dog whose pack had finally returned, complete. "Home," Jeremiah said simply, and the word carried all the weight of their long journey. "Home," Cassandra agreed. Their son was born on a crisp October morning exactly 1 year after the auction where his parents had first met. He came into the world with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined spirit, announcing his arrival with lungs that suggested he intended to make his presence known. "What should we call him?" Jeremiah asked, cradling the tiny, perfect bundle with the wonder of a man who'd never expected to hold his own child. "Hope," Cassandra said softly, "because that's what he represents. That's what we found when we found each other." "Hope Kane," Jeremiah tested the name. "I like it." As autumn turned to winter, news filtered in from Denver about the trials of Franklin Morse and his associates. The federal prosecutors had built an unshakable case, and one by one, the members of the criminal organization were convicted and sentenced. Morse himself received life imprisonment for the attempted murder of Judge Morrison, ensuring he would never again threaten the women he'd exploited. Other news was equally satisfying. The 3 women who had disappeared were found alive and safe, hidden away by relatives who'd feared for their safety. With Morse's organization dismantled, they came forward to testify, adding their voices to the chorus of justice that had begun with Cassandra's courage. "Any regrets?" Jeremiah asked one evening as they sat by their fireplace, Hope sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms. "About what?" Cassandra replied, though she knew what he meant. "About the auction. About the way we met. About everything that brought you to that platform in Millbrook." Cassandra considered the question, thinking about the long journey that had led her from a privileged life in Boston to a scarred woman standing on an auction block to the contented wife and mother she'd become. "No regrets," she said finally. "Not about any of it. The fire, the scars, the desperation that brought me west, all of it led me to you, to this life, to him." She looked down at their sleeping son. "How could I regret the path that brought me everything I never knew I wanted?" "Even the scars?" Jeremiah asked gently. Cassandra touched the marked side of her face, the skin that had once seemed like a symbol of her ruin, but now felt like a badge of survival. "Especially the scars. They're part of my story, part of what made me strong enough to fight for this life we've built." As winter deepened around their ranch, Cassandra and Jeremiah settled into the rhythm of their new life as a family. The quiet cowboy had found his voice in defending those he loved, while the scarred bride had discovered that true beauty came not from unmarked skin, but from the courage to keep fighting when everything seemed lost. Their love story had begun on an auction block, born from desperation and circumstance, but it had grown into something deeper and more precious than either had dared imagine, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of love that could weather any storm. Years later, when Hope was old enough to ask about the scars on his mother's face, Cassandra would tell him the truth. She would explain how sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best things in our lives, how strength can grow from suffering, and how love can bloom in the most unlikely places. She would tell him about a quiet cowboy who saw past scars to the woman beneath, who fought for her when she couldn't fight for herself, who proved that true love isn't about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone worth fighting for. And she would tell him that sometimes, when you're brave enough to step onto an auction block with your chin held high despite your fears, you might just find everything you never knew you were looking for. The quiet cowboy and the veiled bride had found their happy ending, not in spite of their scars and struggles, but because of them. In a world that often seemed cruel and unforgiving, they had created something beautiful together, a love that transformed them both, and a legacy that would endure long after their own story had ended. And if that wasn't worth fighting for, Cassandra thought as she watched her husband teaching their son to gentle a young horse, then nothing in this world was. Up next, you got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.